While the modern day weed supply in the UK is generally of very good quality, we did once have a horrific trend which saw unscrupulous dealers adding tiny glass beads to weed in order to bulk out the weight and therefore the price. This happened during an unprecedented drought of weed in the UK. But what is perhaps even more remarkable than the fact that someone would contaminate cannabis in this way is the bizarre set of circumstances that led to that situation. I say that because the years of 2001 to 2009 was absolutely bonkers for UK cannabis policy. The problem with contaminated flower in the UK, which some people called sprayed weed or grit weed or glass weed, peaked in around 2006 to 2007. But the events that caused it, the ripples in the pond, each one influencing the next, actually started half a decade before. This video is about how that ripple effect played out, resulting eventually with the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, having to put out a health warning about this sprayed weed.
I've had enough, and what's more, it's slack as fuck. Stop bastard bagging up this hazardous and rancid stuff. You're skanking us, contaminating the nation with bad budgets, that cunt.
In 2001, the Borough Commander for Lambeth, a police force in South London, a guy called Brian Paddock, was looking for a way to reduce crime in his area. Many residents in Brixton, an area within Lambeth, were worried about spiralling acquisitive crime like burglaries and street robberies. Paddock looked at the crime rates and the resources allocated to tackling it and decided that, quote, police hunting for people who use small amounts of cannabis is a waste of scarce resources and diverts officers from tackling much more serious criminals.
The other problem that came up on his desk was that a lot of officers were taking cannabis off people, but there's a procedure for how you dispose of it, right? You don't just chuck it in the bin, right? There's a procedure. Mm-hmm. And a lot of their officers, some of them, were not following this procedure to the point where one or two of them got sacked. So Brian Paddock took a step back from this and started to consult with the local community and said, look, we're going to have to take the foot off the pedal when it comes to cannabis. What do you think? Mm-hmm. And of the people they polled, a large percentage of them said, well, okay, if you're going to deal with all this other shoplifting and all of that, okay, we'll go along with it. Newspaper reporter for the London Evening Standard got hold of this story and splashed it all over the front page. Brian Paddock had not mentioned this to his bosses in the Met. They were not happy, but they had to spin it as a pilot project.
He therefore pioneered a scheme where people who were caught with small amounts of cannabis for personal use were given a warning and their weed would be confiscated. The possession of small amounts of cannabis was temporarily depenalised and tolerated. It was no longer a prosecutable offence during this scheme. Paddock told The Guardian 80% of people were in favour of the effective decriminalisation of cannabis for personal use.
This would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. But the debate about cannabis has moved on to such an extent that even among politicians there is now widespread tacit acceptance of its use. Today, cannabis has come to exist in a kind of twilight zone of confusing semi-legality.
Police in Lambeth in South London have begun a 6-month experiment. Anyone caught with cannabis will be given an informal warning rather than being arrested and cautioned or prosecuted.
This video is brought to you by Easy Test Kits, quick, reliable and affordable drug testing kits for all your favourite party prescriptions. They are presumptive testing kits that can give you a very good indication as to what is in your baggie. Remember, you can only make informed decisions when you've got a good idea of what you're dealing with. If you want to learn more or buy a testing kit yourself, head to the description below and use my promo code SESH for a 10% discount. This policing experiment, which was known as the Lambeth Cannabis Warning Scheme or sometimes the Brixton Experiment, took place from July 2001 to July 2002, only in the borough of Lambeth. According to research, in the first 6 months, officers and civilian staff saved more than 2,500 hours, and non-drug crime fell by 9% overall, with the sharpest declines seen in burglaries and street robberies. Almost 2/3 of the local community thought it had improved relations between the police and the community. The police said that a poll of 2,055 Lambeth residents showed that 83% either supported the experiment outright or conditionally.
Until it became clear that a lot of people were coming into Lambeth to smoke cannabis on the basis they weren't going to get done. So the local citizenry were not happy about this. The local media went up the wall. Councillors were not happy.
That's what researchers called the goldfish effect. Other people were looking in and saying, well, that's interesting, and they were travelling to that area. So critics of the scheme argued that showed that relaxing the laws on cannabis would increase the uses, but then proponents of the scheme argued that if the laws would have been relaxed everywhere in the UK at the same time, then they wouldn't have had that sort of goldfish effect. But anyway, regardless of that, the downfall of the Brixton Experiment came in the way of the unfortunate downfall of Brian Paddick himself. The Mail on Sunday released an expose on him. They published an interview with quotes from 2 of his exes, one of them saying that he let him smoke cannabis in his flat, and the other one saying that he smoked cannabis himself. That created a public backlash against him, and therefore by extension against the Brixton Experiment. So with the reputation of the experiment in tatters, he was transferred out of Lambeth, and that was the end of the Brixton Experiment. Paddick eventually took the newspaper to court and won. The newspaper admitted that the story was false. It also emerged in court that Brian Paddick's exes had been paid by the newspaper £106,000 for their sort of involvement in this witch hunt. The newspaper ended up apologising and having to pay Paddick off. But the Brixton Experiment wasn't a total waste of time, because politicians started warming to the idea of weed.
And all the major political parties seem to see being soft on cannabis as a way to win votes.
The possession of cannabis should no longer be an arrestable offence, the words of the Home Secretary David Blunkett.
Downgrading cannabis, doctors say it's not as dangerous as other Class B drugs.
In the most radical shift of drugs policy from any of Britain's major parties, the Liberal Democrats have voted to press for the legalisation of cannabis.
The then Home Secretary David Blunkett had been watching events unfolding. He told the Home Affairs Committee in 2001 that he was minded to downgrade cannabis and would seek advice from the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs on the possibility of a reclassification. The following year, the Advisory Council reported back that they believed cannabis should be reclassified, and in July 2003 it was announced that on parliamentary approval, cannabis would be reclassified to a Class C drug, with the new rules coming into force in January 2004.
There's been a major change in the government's policy on drugs. The Home Secretary has announced proposals to reclassify cannabis from a Class B to a Class C drug.
Those changes mean possessing small amounts of the drug will effectively be tolerated, but selling it will still be out of the question.
The penalties for possession were reduced, but the government adjusted the law, increasing the penalties for dealing cannabis.
So essentially, the government then invented a new class, really, where the penalties for possession would be the same as a Class C drug, but the penalties for dealing it would be the same as a Class B drug. So it's not really reclassifying, it's putting cannabis in a class of its own. So it might as well be called AAA. If they're going to reverse, if the government's going to reverse the reclassifying of cannabis, then presumably that means it's back as a Class B drug. It won't affect the dealers because they're still doing Class B sentences for trading in cannabis, but it will affect people caught in possession, smoking it, which means they will now be liable for several years imprisonment. So reversing the reclassification wouldn't affect dealers at all and completely fuck up smokers.
At the time, public support of cannabis was at a high. A survey indicated that 49% of British adults supported cannabis decriminalisation, 36% were against, 15% were undecided. It was claimed that this would leave the police with more resources to deal with more serious crimes and with victims. This appeared to work. Arrests for weed possession fell by 1/3 in the first year, which saved an estimated 199,000 police hours.
Now, the police unofficially had been okay with this, but they realised that if you reduced cannabis from B to C, they would lose their power of arrest. And if they did that, it would mean that if they stopped someone for cannabis, they couldn't then go and search their flat or something in case they had a gun there or something like that. So they had to work that one out. So they did work that out. And they also managed to convince the Home Secretary to increase the penalties for dealing and trafficking. Why? Because there was, at the same time, there was the beginnings of what became Britain's homegrown market for cannabis.
That changed the nature of the cannabis supply in the UK forever. It also cemented a long-term shift away from resin or cannabis hash as being the most dominant form of cannabis in the UK to sort of domestically grown flower. The most comprehensive article written about this time was this one called Plant Warfare. It was written by Max Daly and it was published at the very beginning of 2007 in Drug Link magazine. Quote, cannabis cultivation carried out everywhere from inner city lofts to patches of remote farmland is booming in Britain. Plants are being grown and harvested at record levels to cater for a rapidly changing UK cannabis market, Daly wrote. Quote, 10 years ago, only 11% of cannabis sold in the UK was grown here, a figure which has now passed 60%. He added, quote, homegrown cannabis filled the hole because of widespread disillusionment with the quality of imported resin amongst drug users. At the same time, according to the UN, Morocco's cannabis crop, a key source of imported UK cannabis resin, has been shrunk by almost half in 3 years under a government eradication scheme. Before cannabis got downgraded to Class C, the media seemed to be pretty positive about relaxing the laws. But after this, when the homegrown weed came onto the scene, they changed that. They started a smear campaign because the homegrown cannabis was much stronger than the cannabis resin.
And you grow cannabis under strong lights, hydroponically without any soil. You finish up with stronger cannabis than you might otherwise have got from hash. Now, as soon as that got into the press, it was like, cannabis is now 100 times stronger than it was in the 1960s, you know, okay.
The media said that it was skunk cannabis and this was the end of cannabis's good PR. This study looked at 460 samples and found that the domestically grown weed had THC levels of around 13-14%, whilst the resin had THC levels of around 6%. According to this 2006 news report, police are concerned that the British-produced cannabis contains more THC, the psychoactive component in cannabis, than foreign imports. Analysis of recent homegrown halls detected THC levels as high as 20%, nearly 7 times higher than the samples of imported resin, which used to be the predominant form of the drug on the streets and typically contained around 3% THC. Experts fear that this could have health implications for the country's 2 million regular cannabis users.
The other concern is that apparently THC is much, much stronger these days than it was. I would tend to agree with that. I don't think 20 times stronger, perhaps twice as strong, perhaps. But that just means you've got half as much in a joint, doesn't it? I mean, what the fuck is going on?
In September 2006, police forces in 17 English counties launched Operation 𝙬𝙖𝙣𝙪𝙜𝙪, a national crackdown on what they called skunk-producing cannabis farms. It was a vicious campaign against the domestic growers who were now supplying most of the weed in the country. Daly wrote in Plant Warfare, the analysis of nationwide police raids reveals around 2/3 to 3/4 of cannabis farms were run by Vietnamese criminal gangs. According to this 2007 article, 80% of the grows that were raided in Operation 𝙬𝙖𝙣𝙣𝙪 had over 50 plants, with most using a simple setup of overhead lights, fans and plant pots. The electricity meter was usually bypassed, they said, to power the high-intensity lamps without alerting the power company. Paul, a spokesperson for one of the largest UK cannabis seed banks, was quoted by DrugLink at the time and said, there has been a steady growth in UK homegrown and farming sector since 2001. In the past 4 years, Vietnamese gangs have taken over wholesale farming. They know what they're doing. They are trained, professional, and it is increasingly widespread. The startup costs can be anything from 10 to 20k. It's unclear exactly how many raids took place during Operation 𝙬𝙖𝙣𝙣𝙪, but what is clear is what happened next. It caused a widespread drought of cannabis in the UK. It wasn't impossible to get cannabis. Some people who had good connections still could, but for huge amounts of people in the UK, it was impossible to get cannabis. And that is surprising to me. It's astonishing, actually, because it's such a rare situation where the authorities get to even land a punch in the war on drugs, but on this occasion they won the battle. They definitely didn't win the war. So there was a problem with supply and demand. There was a lot of demand but not a lot of supply, and that's where things took a turn for the worse, because many people in the cannabis community said unscrupulous suppliers started bulking their products out to boost the weight and therefore boost their profits of what little amount of weed was in the country.
I want a fat buzz, not bad lungs from sugar and glass dust. It's your pack punch, not that lush. You're having a laugh, bud. What the fuck am I gonna do with that, bud?
But first, the health alert that went out in England, but due to a communication breakdown in the Welsh Assembly government, not in Wales. It warned of potentially lethal contaminated cannabis that's flooded illegal drugs markets across Wales. It's been cut with glass, sand and quartz by criminal gangs said to be in Holland. Pro-cannabis activists say it's been caused by a police clampdown on British cannabis factories.
Police raids like these have successfully closed down cannabis growers by the dozen across Wales and England in recent months.
Max Daly again broke this story in DrugLink magazine. He wrote, the vulnerability of the new localised UK weed market from police raids on cannabis farms was exposed with the emergence of what some people have called gritweed in the last year. Large-scale cannabis producers took advantage of a drought created by Operation 𝙬𝙖𝙣𝙣𝙪 to flood the market with adulterated weed, designed to give the producers a maximum return on their profits from drug users eager to get their hands on whatever cannabis was available. Police and cannabis experts say the producers of the rogue weed, which prompted an NHS hazard warning because of its lung-damaging properties, sprayed plants with cilia, tiny glass beads used to make road paint reflective. The cilia not only boosted the weight of a consignment, but fooled people into thinking the product was covered in trichomes, crystal-like nodules which make cannabis a higher grade. In fact, the trichomes have been removed and sold separately.
The top quality cannabis leaf always had this sort of glossy feel to it. So there was some...
Trichomes, they call it.
Yeah, that's right. And there was something, if you made cannabis look a bit like this, you know, you could charge more for it and it would look stronger than it actually was.
According to one cannabis seller, the contaminated cannabis was produced in Holland and distributed in Liverpool, although the police could not confirm this. Derek Williams, a spokesperson for the UK cannabis internet activists, said, quote, the gritweed would not have happened without Operation 𝙬𝙖𝙣𝙪. The raids created a hole in the market which was filled with someone producing the adulterated weed. There are huge quantities of adulterated weed in Europe, especially France and England. The beads were probably sprayed onto the plants using a handheld aerosol spray with glass beads in the propellant. You can't tell immediately because the tiny beads are buried in the buds, so people are still buying it. The regretful thing about this is that the government is refusing to control cannabis as a drug, and this is putting people's health at risk. The UK cannabis internet activists released a further statement saying, "How dangerous is this contamination? The answer to that is no one really knows. It's a totally unmeasurable unknown. The only sensible advice is really simple. Don't sell gritweed, don't buy gritweed, and don't smoke gritweed." The charity Drugscope issued their own warning, quote, "We want to make people aware of it from a public health point of view. If you are smoking this stuff and taking it into your lungs, that is not good news." A 2009 study confirmed that inhaling these beads could indeed damage one's lungs.
And then you get the transition from Tony Blair to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown was never, was never going to be a supporter of drug law reform. And there was unproven claims that Gordon Brown had managed to do a deal with Paul Dacre, who was the editor of the Daily Mail. And the deal was, you do something about, cannabis back to B, do something about immigration, and there was something else. You tackle that and we'll support you in the newspaper. I don't know how true any of that was, and I think Gordon Brown would have been minded to do it anyway. So Gordon Brown leans on Jackie Smith, who's the Home Secretary, and that's it. Cannabis goes back from C to B.
So this is actually what happened. Here's Gordon Brown on his happier days. And, Gordon Brown, when he was leader of the Labour Party, had an off-the-record illegal meeting with Paul Dacre, the editor of the Daily Mail, when he asked Paul Dacre if he would support him, the Mail would support Labour in the next election. It was an absurd question. I mean, the Mail has, the Mail supported Hitler. It's very unlikely to support Stalin, but no, that was a joke. Gordon was not that bad, but so anyway, he met. And apparently Dacre said to him, "Yes, the Mail will support you in the next election if you do three things. You've got to reduce the top rate of income tax from 50% to 45%. Check. The Labour Party did that within weeks. You've got to put a cap on immigration of 200,000 a year. Check. Gordon did that. And you've got to reclassify cannabis. Check. And Gordon did that. And the Labour Party reclassified cannabis and carried on this campaign of arresting young people for cannabis possession, because they thought if they showed they were hard on drugs, they would get elected. They didn't get elected. One of the reasons they didn't get elected because the Daily Mail reneged on its promise. As you might have imagined, it didn't support Labour. It could never support Labour. It's not in its blood. But he sold the soul of the Labour Party and used prosecution of young people for drugs as part of the sale. Now we have 1 million young people in this country with criminal convictions for possessing cannabis. It undermines their life opportunities, but it also undermines their belief in justice. Getting arrested for having a bit of cannabis in your pocket by a policeman who you know is going to drink more dangerous amounts of alcohol that night than the cannabis you have is unjust, and young people know that.
So, because of the media calling Gordon Brown soft on drugs, and because Gordon Brown being bullied by the Daily Mail and having these secret meetings, as well as the press sort of demonising skunk, demonising cannabis, and because of the arrival of all this gritweed stuff, a decision was taken in January 2009 to put cannabis back up to Class B status again. It's the only drug to have been downgraded under this policy. In fact, it had its classification changed twice in 5 years. In modern day times, 2025, I'm happy to say that the quality of cannabis in the UK is very, very high. Users have actually got quite fussy of their cannabis now in recent times in the UK. We've got a lot of influence of sort of cannabis culture from the Californian cannabis scene coming over to the UK, and it's extremely rare now to see any of this sort of sprayed weed, although you do still get the occasional situation with sprayed weed in the UK still. With these sort of modern day isolated incidents, you can look to the UK cannabis social clubs who do a great job in warning people about these kind of things. Here's a 2014 warning they put out. Here's the 2023 warning they put out. We had a warning in 2024 from Leafy magazine. And in 2025, you can see that the UK Cannabis Social Clubs again provided a warning. However, these are sort of isolated incidents and it's nowhere near like a general trend like it was in 2006, 2007.
It really was a moment in time, which often happens in the illicit drug market. You have moments in time when things appear and then they go away.
But we're seeing contamination in different forms in the UK now, mainly the THC vapes. We are seeing a lot of contamination with them, a lot of synthetic cannabinoids put into them as well, unfortunately. So it just goes to show that sadly, as long as there is some sort of cannabis prohibition in the UK, we are going to see contamination in one way or another. But thankfully, it's only isolated incidents now rather than a general trend.